All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Justice and Pieces guest speaker series. Today's guest, kicking off the brand new 2022, needs no introduction. He's been doing this for many decades. You've probably read, maybe hit some of his textbook there in securities law, but some of you for in studying ethics right now may have known him for a completely different reason. And he's also a bencher at the law site, so we can talk about that as well. So first of all, thank you so much, Joseph Groia, here for joining us today. Really happy to have you on here. And perhaps maybe you can start by telling us a bit about your distinguished background there. I mean, so much you can. I mean, I don't know if that might take the whole 45 minutes right there, but thanks again for joining us. And we're glad to have you on here.
Well, thank you, John Paul. Thank you for the invitation. I've been a trial lawyer for about 45 years now. I started trying cases back in 1976 when I was a law student at the U of T. My first trial was in what was then provincial court, now provincial offenses court. It was a careless driving case, and I unsuccessfully defended a woman who had been charged with careless driving. And it's been a long time, but I still remember the taste of losing that decision. I got called to the bar in 1981. I spent a few years working for Ian Binney and Bob Sharp and George Strathy, and then I went to the Securities Commission. I was there for 5 years, and I spent 10 years as a litigation partner with a great law firm called Heenan Blakey that regrettably is no longer with us. And in the turn of the millennium, I opened my own firm where we practice securities and corporate litigation. There are 10 of us now, and we're just celebrating our 22nd anniversary in business. So I got elected as a bencher in 2015, in part because of the charges against me that the Law Society brought for professional misconduct. And I figured if you can't beat them, you should join them, which is the last thing they were expecting me to do. And so that's probably in a nutshell as good an overview as I can give you, John Paul.
Yeah, it's great. Very, very succinct, and covers so much there in so few words there. But let's start there, right, with Bree X and that case, and the Law Society. I mean, I can't imagine now. I think you were telling me it's coming up on 25 years that you'd be still talking about that and the journey there, and the duty of civility and the whole proceedings there. So, I mean, I'll turn it over to you. You can sort of bring about how everything came about, and this battle that went all the way to the Supreme Court, and now in the time as well becoming a bencher of the Law Society, and you can certainly tell the students and anyone listening how everything came about and what that process was like.
Sure, Bree X has been probably will always be the most important case of my career. It started back in 1997. Bree X Minerals was the darling of the stock markets, and it went from a stock that traded around 10 cents a share to $228 a share, and then went back down to zero. It was a $6 billion market fraud, the largest mining fraud in the history of mining, and one of the largest frauds in the history of the capital markets. Brex was a company started by David Walsh, who was a stockbroker in Calgary. He met my client, John Felderhoff, who was a very experienced and seasoned exploration geologist who had done a lot of work in Indonesia. And they stumbled upon a property in the Busang, which they believed at the time was the largest gold deposit ever found. For those of you who have spare time on your hands with this latest lockdown, there is a movie that's been made of the Brex story. It stars Matthew McConaughey. The movie is called Gold. You can probably get it on the DVD remainder table for about $2 at Walmart. But it does tell the story of the discovery of the mine and then the collapse of the mine. When I met Mr. Felderhoff in 1997, it had not yet been confirmed that this was indeed a gigantic fraud. And so I was hired to defend him. He was being investigated by government police agencies in Ontario and in Washington. He was being investigated by securities regulators in Alberta, Ontario, and Washington. We even had to deal with the Secret Service because they look after money laundering and counterfeiting issues in the United States. So Mr. Felderhoff went through that investigation, but one of the first things I did was ask him to take a lie detector test because I wanted to find out how he would do on a test, and he passed with flying colors. And so there was never any doubt then or now in my mind that John had been defrauded like so many other people by others at the Bre-X mining site. And so John was never charged with participating or even knowing about the fraud that took place. He was charged with essentially failing to detect the fraud and failing to exercise what we call due diligence. A fascinating part of the story is that the culprit, or at least the person I believe who was the culprit, a Filipino geologist by the name of Michael de Guzman, either fell out of a helicopter or was pushed out of a helicopter, or, as I personally believe, he's alive and well and living somewhere in the Philippines, having staged an elaborate disappearance scheme using a dead body that he bought in Jakarta for $5,000 to $6,000 American dollars. So Mr. Felderhoff faced a trial by the Securities Commission that started in the year 2000. It took us 7 years to do the trial, and he was acquitted of all the charges on the merits by Justice Rin. There's a 550-page decision you can read if you're really bored. I recommend the movie over the decision, but that's entirely up to you. And I did such a good job that the Law Society charged me with 4 counts of professional misconduct in 2009, they believing that I had been too aggressive in the way I defended John. So those charges went from the Law Society in 2009 to the Supreme Court of Canada, where they were disposed of in June of 2018. And I lost every step of the way. I lost at the hearing, at the appeal panel, in the Div Court, in the Court of Appeal. By the time I got to the Supreme Court, the score was 21-1 against me. But there was a miracle that took place, and we won in the Supreme Court by a verdict of 6-3. And so the final score was 24-7 against me, but I got 6 when it really counted. And so all of the charges were dismissed against me. And I had decided to run for bencher in 2015 at a time when I was losing 18-0. And I was elected as a bencher in 2015, re-elected in 2019. And here we are at the beginning of 2022, John Paul starting another lockdown. So that's, again, a high-level overview of a case that's been the most important part of my professional life. And I get up every day hoping I can have another case that's even half as good as Bre-X before I retire. So far, I've had great cases, but nothing that comes close to that one.
I mean, there's so much intrigue. I mean, you mentioned the movie there on the case to begin with, but after the decision, now, when did you kind of get wind that the Law Society, I mean, that must have come as a surprise to you, was commencing this proceedings? And I mean, was there at any point throughout that 18-0 mark there that you thought that's it. I'm going to throw in the towels, and I think there was a suspension recommended, I think, at the very beginning, and say that I'm going to just serve out the punishment here, or what kind of motivated you to kind of keep going at it, and maybe give us a little bit of the thought process and how all that came about and how you kept fighting all the way up to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It's one I still ask myself. I was lucky to have the financial resources to be able to fight all the way through. Briex was an interesting case because Mr. Felderhoff got divorced in the middle of it, ran out of money, and couldn't pay for his defense. So we did the last half of that case for free and ran up a legal bill of about $3 million to finish representing him. And then I ran up a legal bill of another $3 million defending myself. Earl Cherniak acted for us and was very generous and was a huge supporter, but he couldn't do it for free, but he did it at significantly reduced rates. But even at those rates, to take it through all those levels of hearings and courts and all the issues that go along with that is enormously expensive. So secondly, I'd been offered a chance by the Law Society to settle with them. We couldn't agree on terms because essentially they wanted me to admit that it was all my fault, and I, essentially had to take all the blame and all the responsibility. And it was clear to me, and clear, frankly, to the judges who'd heard the case before I got charged, that the Securities Commission was at least equally responsible for any excess of advocacy that took place. As Justice Archie Campbell put it in one of the early decisions, there was no monopoly on incivility in the case. Well, in fact, what part of it that I think really sticks out in my mind is that when we were arguing the case in front of Justice Campbell, the Securities Commission went out and hired Michael Code, who's now Justice Code of the Superior Court, to represent them before Justice Campbell. And in open court, 2 months after 9/11, he called me a bald-faced liar and said I was like a terrorist who throws a bomb into a crowd and runs away. So, there was clearly some pretty harsh rhetoric that was going on. So I just couldn't bring myself to accept that I was going to have to take all the blame and all the responsibility. So we didn't make a deal. And then once the case got going, the Law Society hearing panel made a terrible decision saying that I couldn't even defend myself. It was an abusive process for me to even try and defend myself, which was, in my view, at least one of the worst decisions in administrative law history. So we got that overturned by the appeal panel, who admitted it was a god-awful decision, but then they convicted me all over again. And so I thought when we got to the div court, it would get straightened out. That didn't happen. I lost 3-0. I thought, well, the Court of Appeals straightened it out. We lost 2-1. And I took some heart from Justice David Brown's dissenting decision. So I figured, what the hell, I've been at it for so long now. Let's take a chance and go to Ottawa, which we did on November the 7th, 2017. And it was a cold, wet, rainy, miserable day. And the courtroom was full. In fact, there was an overflow courtroom they had to set up. So many people wanted to come and watch the argument. I guess at the end of the day, I decided to take on the fight as a matter of principle. I'm often a little suspicious when my clients say they want to fight on principle. Often their principles involve, a payment of money. But at the end of this all, I ended up about, even though I won, I ended up about $5.5 million in the hole. So if I fought that on principle for the money, I made a terrible investment decision.
And again, like back before, I mean, you could stream things and watch, packed court there. And so when you got the decision after all that, what, must have been a feeling of vindication and relief there. What, for any of the students there to kind of unpack the decision there in terms of, what you were fighting for in the end. Maybe you can sort of summarize how that was, and what this civility means in terms of defending your client versus respecting the courts and the administrative tribunals and so forth.
Yeah, I think that the people on this call who hopefully will practice as paralegals can take some real comfort in the end result of my case. I have never said, nor do I say tonight, that civility is not an important part of your toolkit as an advocate. And I've always actually considered myself to be a civil lawyer, somebody who is respectful of the court and respectful of the opponents. But what do you do, as I felt I was faced with, when you're dealing with a prosecutor who you believe is acting in a manner that is unethical? And how do you fight fire with fire? And one of the important things to always remember about my case is that the trial judge had no problem with my conduct. And when I teach a class, as I do, on civility, and we go through the language that got me into trouble, I actually was found guilty of professional misconduct by the Law Society because I referred to the prosecutor as the government. I didn't use the F word. I didn't hurl any kind of awful swear words. I didn't use the 6-letter N word. I did what I felt I needed to do to represent Mr. Felderhoft in the face of what I thought was prosecutorial misconduct. And so there was, at the beginning of the 21st century, a real civility movement, an incredible emphasis on trying to get people to play patty cake and sing kumbaya around the campfire. And I was not trained in that tradition. I was trained to represent my clients, take their interests to heart, to do it in a very tough-minded and disciplined sort of way. But I don't go to court to be best friends with the prosecutor. I go to court to get my clients the best result we can. So I had never been criticized by the trial judge. Nobody ever filed a complaint against me. This was all brought by the Law Society because they were trying to, in my view, at least, in a very misguided way, try and dampen down zealous advocacy. It's an interesting statistic that people on this call doing defense work are 8 times more likely to be complained about for alleged uncivil behavior than those people who prosecute cases. Civility arguments are, for the most part, directed at defense lawyers and people working in small firms against big firms, because we are the ones who are, frankly, our clients are in difficult positions and up against the wall, and it requires muscular representation. So, the civility prosecutions are not dead, in the sense that if you go to court tomorrow and you use the F word, or if you, as a lawyer did not long ago, challenge a witness to step outside and have a fist fight, you're going to get into trouble. And you're going to get into trouble because there's now a protocol that allows judges to send complaints to the Law Society about inappropriate conduct. But absent that kind of extreme behavior, absent doing something that is really far outside the boundary of acceptable behavior, you now have a pretty broad scope to do the work you need to do. And if you have a witness in the witness box who's lying, you're entitled to confront that person in very tough language and very harsh terms. And, you can call them out for them telling things that are simply not correct. And you don't need to use flowery words. You can go directly to the critical advocacy point of saying, I suggest to you, sir, that that is simply not true. That is incorrect. That is you are deliberately fabricating your testimony. Do what you have to do to represent your client. And so, it's still very powerful and effective advocacy. It's still important to be civil because judges expect that, and you get out of favor with the judge at your peril. But, again, coming back to my case, the judge was criticizing the prosecutors for what they were doing. He was not criticizing me, and yet I got charged, and the prosecutors never did. So you should keep that in mind if you're going to do any kind of provincial offenses court work, that you are at much greater risk than the prosecutor is, but you also have a much greater freedom of maneuver because as the defense lawyer, you're entitled to zealously represent the interests of your client.
And maybe what you could share from teaching civility there, especially from the defense side, as you mentioned, is you have to kind of find that, you shouldn't be afraid there to ask those tough questions for fear of, being accused of being uncivil, right? I mean, given that you have, again, the deck essentially stacked, right? Given that the resources from the prosecution side or the Crown in a criminal case versus a sole practitioner sometimes, or a small law firm that's representing in many of these cases. So how would you advise for students to kind of who may feel that intimidation there to reconcile, well, hey, I need to still zealously advocate for my client here above all, but at the same time, as you said, absent foul language, I shouldn't have any restrictions placed on me there in terms of how to conduct my cross-examination, let's say.
Yeah, you have to do three things. One, you have to stay away from foul language. I mean, you can't use words that are outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior. So that's easy because we all know the kinds of things you can say and the kinds of things you can't say in a courtroom. Secondly, you need to show real perseverance. You need to watch the judge. You need to make sure that the judge is paying attention, listening carefully. You're not getting criticized, and you're pushing the boundary as far as the judge is going to let you. So it's body language, it's comments, it's interruptions. You're really trying to sell your client's position to hopefully a willing buyer in the judge. And you're going to focus on making sure that what you're doing is finding favor with her. And then thirdly, it's a matter of passion. I mean, it's a matter of having done the work you need to do. And if you have a good argument, if you have a good line of questions, you need to stick with them. I did a Zoom trial not that long ago where I spent almost an hour getting a witness lined up for the knockout punch, and suddenly the screen went blank. They disappeared. And, of course, being a suspicious person, I thought that was not an act of God or an act of nature. But, you've got to be willing to show the commitment to your client's cause and the commitment to the line of questions that you have developed, and you've got to stick with it. So, for the people who are going to be starting to practice, once this Zoom world hopefully comes to an end, I think we're going to go back to an era where courtrooms are going to be overloaded and backlogged, and we need to learn to be efficient and to do our jobs without wasting time, because you're going to get criticized if you waste a lot of time. But there's no reason for anyone who's going to start practicing in the next couple of years, which I think will be a good time to practice, no reason for you to be afraid that my case does anything other than support you doing what you need to do to represent your clients, as long as you don't tell somebody to F off.
Now it's interesting you brought up that the screen cutting there, and in terms of zealously advocating in the Zoom era, maybe you can share a little bit about the differences in terms of being able to do it in person. I mean, again, tomorrow again can't go dining indoors and all sorts of restrictions. So looks like at least for the next little while that there'll be more matters online. So anything there from that experience, whether from that particular case or anything else that you can share with students about being able to zealously advocate in the Zoom era?
Yeah, there's a couple of things about Zoom. Zoom works pretty well where you're not dealing with a witness. You can make a pretty decent argument. You can make submissions to a judge. You can do a scheduling. You can do a guilty plea. All of that works pretty well on Zoom, and I don't have a problem with that. The two problems with Zoom are the management of documents, because using paper on Zoom, screen sharing as a function is terrible. And so if you're going to start to actually zealously represent clients, you got to learn how to handle paper on Zoom. And what I do now is and of course I'm dealing with bigger cases and bigger issues, but I send to the judge and the other side a set of the paper in hard copy form. So we're able to use paper on the table without having to worry about putting stuff up on the screen. Where Zoom really breaks down, and I wrote an article about this in the Law Times a few months back, is when you're dealing with a hostile witness. And I cannot as effective, I can examine my own clients just fine because we've rehearsed and we're both working like a team. It's like dancing with the stars, and you're doing what you have to do because you've practiced and you've prepared. But when you're going to cross-examine a hostile witness, somebody who's wanting to be difficult, it's very difficult to do on Zoom. And I wish you the very best, because I feel I'm about only 50 or 60% as effective in cross-examination on Zoom as I am in person. So I'm about to start a month-long trial that was supposed to be in Sudbury. And we've just been told today we're going to do it on Zoom, and I'm just not happy about that. But my choice is an indefinite delay. I have elderly clients, and so I can't really afford to have the trial be pushed off into Never Never Land. So you can learn the skill of dealing with the paper. You can properly prepare your clients. And all I can do is give you my best wishes when it comes to cross-examination, because it just doesn't work nearly as well.
Now, and thanks for sharing that there, that it's, certainly who knows when we'll get back to being able to do those trials again in person, hopefully sooner rather than later. Now, one of the other things that is interesting there, obviously, is during this whole process, you decide to run for bencher. What kind of spurred that on? And maybe you can tell some of the students who may not know exactly what a bencher does, how that's been over the last, I think, 6+ years for you in terms of serving as a bencher for the Law Society.
Yeah, bencher basically means we sit on the board of directors of the Law Society, and there's a half a dozen paralegal benchers. So those of you who are going to get called to be paralegals will get a chance to vote for paralegal benchers probably in the 2019-2023 election. So this term started in 19, ends in 23. The election will be May or June. So I would hope by then most of you have gotten your paralegal license. Being a bencher is the best of times and the worst of times. It's a very large amount of work, interesting issues, nice people, important problems to try and deal with. I ran for it because I felt they'd made some terrible decisions in my case. And frankly, I was looking for a sense of the way the profession felt about the fight that I was fighting. Because back in 2015, when I had lost 3 rounds at that point, the profession had not supported me, and I was elected with one of the largest pluralities in Toronto. I would have felt maybe I'm wasting my time on this fight. Nobody seems to care. But when I got elected by a very significant number of people, I felt somewhat enheartened, as though the work that I was doing and the money I was spending was at least not going unnoticed. So I spent the first 6 months learning as much as I could about what I needed to know in order to do a job as a bencher. And I spent the next 3.5 years working very hard to try and contribute on those issues. I deliberately stayed off of discipline hearings. I didn't think somebody who was under charges should be deciding the fate of lawyers and paralegals, so I chose not to do that. And I still never have done that. I decided it's really just not the right place or thing for me to do. But the last few years have been even more difficult. I just wrote another article in the Law Times talking about the election of a slate called the Stop SOP Group. And they are 22 members strong, and they share a united view about the Law Society, and they share a view that I don't support. So the last 2.5 years have been virtually a nonstop series of arguments with them, trying to keep the Law Society moving in what I think to be a good direction, and making sure that it doesn't go back into a bad direction. I've also been the chair of audit and finance for the last year and a half, and that sort of makes me the assistant treasurer of the Law Society. It's like the vice president in the United States, and we've been very lucky. The legal profession has done incredibly well through COVID. There have been a few people who have struggled, and we came up with a hardship fund to try and help them by waiving their dues for a year. But most law firms and most legal professionals have done incredibly well. The ones on the paralegal side who have struggled, of course, are the ones who do a lot of provincial offenses court work, because those have been shut down for the most part. And I know there's been real hardship for paralegals trying to represent people in a court system that's still, for the most part, shut down. We're told there's over 250,000 POA cases backlogged in Toronto, and I can't imagine we're going to do anything other than get rid of most of those, because there's just no way the system could ever process that many backlogged cases. But we have to come back to life sooner or later. I'm optimistic we're going to get there. I had hoped we were going to get there in January, but now my hopes are backed up to February, and maybe it'll be March before too long.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly must be quite the challenge there, where you have, a slate of 22 people and trying to navigate getting something through. Or I know, like, things like articling students getting a minimum wage, I think was something that recently came up. But again, it's great that we are discussing these things, and things are changing, and certainly trying to navigate as best as possible in the times with COVID and everything. So it's great to hear from benchers and what's going on, and kind of behind the scenes that we may not necessarily know until we see a decision or something come up.
I'm in favor of a minimum wage for articling students. I'm also in favor of a minimum wage for law clerks and paralegals during placements. Most placements, as far as we know, are unpaid, and I just don't think that's right.
Now, in terms of in terms of everything here, looking in terms of your whole career here, and going back and with students here, wanting to know what they're entering into the profession. One of the things, actually, we've been talking quite a bit with our guests there is about taking care. I mean, especially in COVID, your own mental health, and the law profession certainly. A lot of stressors there on licensees. Anything that you can share from either as a bencher or just from yourself there of the importance of that, and how the profession has changed in terms of over the decades there of being more supportive, hopefully, there of mental health and wellness initiatives.
Yeah, two comments. One, the Law Society provides enormous support mechanisms. So if you are dealing with a stress issue or a mental health issue, and once you become a member of the society, you're entitled to access our support programs. I think some of them are even available as placement students. So you need to reach out and take advantage of professional advice and professional assistance. Secondly, I had 9 years of stress dealing with my charges, and so I learned a lot about stress management. And I followed three rules that I would recommend. One, you need to keep a close watch on your physical health because stress will eventually start to affect your health in ways that go beyond just the mental health aspects of it. So you need to keep an eye on your weight and your blood pressure and make sure you're doing all the things you need to do. I'm not somebody who's ever exercised, so I can't say that I followed an exercise program, but I'd certainly encourage people who do exercise to follow that kind of program. Secondly, you need to rely on the support of your family and your friends. I mean, they are dealing with stress is not a one person endeavor, and you want to take advantage of people around you if you have them and use their skills and their willingness to help as best you can. And then thirdly, I found that practicing what I consider to be a form of mindfulness was a very real help. There's lots of YouTube stuff about it. It's not quite like meditation, but it does teach you the skills to learn how to deal with the stressors that are in your life and to manage them, as best you can. And to, I learned as best I could to focus on the things that I could control and I could change, and to stop trying to stress about the things I couldn't control and I couldn't change. There's an awful tendency when you're charged with professional misconduct to feel sorry for yourself. And that's a temptation you need to resist as best you can because it doesn't really help. And in fact, I think detracts from your ability to deal with the problem and also to deal with the stress that comes from the problem. If I had $1 for every time I was up at 3 or 4 in the morning thinking about my case and my future, I probably could retire from the money I would have made.
Now, thank you so much, Joseph, there for taking the time here and sharing with my students and anyone else listening. Really appreciate it sharing all that about the case and everything that we've covered here today. Wondering if you end with any final words of wisdom, looking back on your career there, any advice for students looking to enter into the profession of what is in store for them. And once again, thanks for taking the time and joining us.
Well, you're welcome, John Paul. Thank you for inviting me. I've been doing this for many, many years, and I have to admit I still really love what I do. I think it'll be a great time for your students to be coming out into the legal market. It's a wonderful profession. It's a wonderful thing to have people put their trust and confidence in you and count on you to do the best you can to help them when they're in very difficult circumstances. So I really encourage all of your students to stick with it and get their designation and find a place to work. I'm not sure that trying to hang up your own shingle would be the way to go. I'm not, we're seeing that part of the paralegal profession not do as well, but we're seeing lots of opportunities in law firms and business and other areas where you're not out there trying to sell services, you're providing, highly skilled legal support. And if you can find that kind of niche, I really do think it's a great opportunity for you to really develop a professional calling that I, to this day, still find incredibly rewarding. So I've got a couple of minutes for questions if there are any. John Paul, you're the host, so you would see them. I'm not sure I would.
I just see a question about benchers, and are there any? How often are the terms? I think it's 4 years there you mentioned, but you can confirm that. And is there, is it like something like there's term limits, or can you run essentially every time? Or
Yeah, no, it's every 4 years. Next election is May. Well, it's sort of a 2 month long election, so it starts sort of next March of 2023 and ends, I think, in May of 2023. There are term limits. You can be a bencher for a maximum of 12 years. We used to have life benchers who were there till they were carried out on a stretcher, but there's now a 12-year limit. So I still haven't decided if I'm going to run again for my last term. I've had two, and that might be enough for me, but I'm still undecided about that.
perfect. Let's see if there's any last questions here from any of the students. But once again, really appreciate you taking the time here and joining us, and wish you all the best. Happy New Year and all the best in 2022. And again, stay safe, everyone.
Thanks so much, and best of luck to everybody with getting a placement and getting a certification and getting a job.
Perfect. Thanks. And again, for all the students, as Joseph mentioned there, Mr. Groia, that some of those resources, like the member assistance program, you can access even as students. So if you do need any assistance, don't hesitate to reach out to the Law Society member assistance program. All right. Take care, everyone. And thanks again.
Okay. Good night.